You ever watch a company unravel because one person thinks rules don't matter? This story gets tense fast. Stick with me to the end. Hit subscribe if you want more real stories like this. Tanner Caldwell stared right through me like I was a chair somebody forgot to throw out. He stood at the front of the conference room with a fresh haircut and a fresh title, smiling like he was doing us all a favor. On the screen behind him was a slide that said, "New Arcata, better, faster, lighter," like we were a shoe brand. My stomach tightened because I already knew what came next. My name's Blaine Frazier. I was 58 years old then, living in Burbank, California, and for 12 years, I was the guy at Arcadia Set and Safety Services nobody noticed until something caught fire. Arcadia didn't haul freight or do camera tricks. We kept film and commercial shoots legal and insurable. Permits, union rules, kid work limits, stunt sign-offs, all the boring stuff that kept people alive and kept productions from getting shut down. I liked being the quiet fixer. No speeches. No spotlight, just calls returned, forms filed, and problems stopped before they turned into ambulances. Warren Caldwell built the company that way. He wasn't soft, just older. He wanted to drink wine on a vineyard instead of babysitting grown adults in a conference room. So he handed the keys to his son. Tanner was 35, MBA sharp, and talked like every sentence belonged on a stage with applause. He didn't ask what worked. He walked in and started relabeling everything like the words were the problem. Compliance became enablement. Safety became experience. I watched him say it with a straight face, like changing labels changed reality. About 2 minutes into his vision, he waved a hand toward me. "Blaine's been doing legacy sign-offs," he said, like I was a dusty printer. "We're going to modernize that. Quick note, before listening, share which city or country you're watching from. And let's continue." A woman at the table laughed a little too loud. Cassidy Larkin. Everyone called her Kay. Tanner had brought her in as head of culture and brand experience, which meant she ran vibes, cameras, and excuses. She wore a badge like she owned the building, and she held her phone face up on the table like it might be recording. I kept my voice flat. My signature isn't a vibe. Unions, insurers, and city offices recognize it because I've kept my word for years. Tanner leaned on the table, still smiling. "That's great, Blaine, but we're not doing gatekeepers anymore. We're empowering teams." Cassidy added, "We want alignment. No more bottlenecks." I looked around the room at people who'd been on sets when a bad call turned into a serious injury. Nobody met my eyes. They were already learning the new rule. Nod, clap, survive. I nodded once, slow. "If you break continuity, approvals pause. That's not my opinion. That's in the agreements." Tanner's smile tightened, just for a second. Pride. That was the first real flash of it. He didn't care about safety yet. He cared that I said no in front of witnesses. He clicked to the next slide like he'd erased me. I opened my folder, slid my continuity clause printout onto the table, and tapped it with my finger. Tanner didn't even glance at the paper I'd tapped. He kept talking like the clause was background noise, and the room followed his lead because that was the safest thing for them to do. I pulled the page back into my folder, closed it slow, and felt my jaw tighten because I could already see where this was headed. The changes came fast, like he was trying to prove he deserved the chair by moving everything around. He pushed streamlined approvals, which really meant fewer signatures and more, "We'll handle it later." He cut the number of eyes on high-risk days, called it lean, and acted shocked when I said lean was how people got hurt. Every set I dealt with ran on timing and paperwork, and he treated that like an attitude problem instead of physics. Cassidy made it worse by turning mornings into performance. She ran mandatory huddles in the open area by the conference rooms, right where you could hear phones ringing and printers spitting out permit packets. She'd clap first and force everyone else to clap, smiling like we were in a game show while the permit clock ticked like it didn't care about anyone's feelings. "We celebrate wins before we chase tasks," she'd say, and I'd watch a coordinator stare at their watch like they were watching a fuse burn down. One afternoon, a location manager called me from a commercial set, voice jittery, saying they were about to run a stunt with a vehicle slide. I checked the file, saw the plan still sitting in draft, and I didn't dress it up. I said, "That stunt plan isn't approved, and it isn't happening today because nobody signed off on the controls." The manager tried to argue, then went quiet, because people get real respectful when they realize you're the one standing between them and an injury report. An hour later, I got pulled into a meeting about my tone. Tanner sat across from me with Cassidy beside him, her phone on the table again like it belonged there. Tanner said, "Blaine, you can't shut down partners in the field without alignment." I stared at him and answered the only honest way I knew. "I didn't shut down a partner. I stopped an unapproved stunt, and you don't need alignment to follow the rules." That was the part he hated, not the safety call. He didn't like that I said no without asking permission first, like I needed a hall pass to do my job. He liked people who said yes with a smile and fixed it later, because later didn't show up in his face during business hours. Cassidy jumped in with her smooth little voice and said, "We can coach you on delivery so you don't create fear." I told her, "Fear is what keeps people from doing dumb things, and that's not a defect." Outside of work, my life was already tight in ways Tanner didn't care about. My ex-wife kept leaning on me about our kids' college costs, like I had a money tree growing in my garage. She'd call and say, "You need to step up because tuition is due." And I'd bite my tongue and answer, "I am stepping up, but I also need to keep my job and my health insurance." I hated admitting it, but the insurance mattered more than pride, because getting sick at my age wasn't some imaginary risk. I started hearing more from the crews at Nadine D. Kroll's all-night diner near the stages. Guys would slide into the booth behind me and talk loud, not even trying to hide it, saying budgets were getting weird and approvals were getting rushed. One grip muttered, "Cassidy acts like she owns the place," and Tanner just nods. I kept my coffee moving, kept my eyes down, and listened because sets tell the truth when managers lie. After a safety meeting, Big Sal Donato pulled me aside in the hallway, close enough that nobody else could hear. He didn't yell or joke, and that's how I knew it was serious. He said, "Your new boss is treating safety like a game, and I don't like it." I nodded once, then turned and walked straight toward Tanner's office with my continuity clause folder in my hand. The air in there was too cold, like he thought freezing the room made him look sharper, and Cassidy's laugh carried down the hall before I even hit the doorway. Tanner looked up like I was an appointment he didn't remember booking. "Blaine, if this is about vibes again, we already covered that," he said, leaning back like he was relaxed. I set the folder on his desk and said, "This is about continuity and key signatory language, and you need to stop acting like a title replaces it." He flipped the top page without reading, then pushed it back toward me with 2 fingers. "We're updating processes, and you need to trust the direction," he said, like trust was a button you pressed. I kept my voice even, because I wasn't giving him the satisfaction. "I trust procedures that keep people safe and keep us insured, and this clause is what triggers a freeze if you mess with the chain." He smiled like I was talking about a museum exhibit. "You're acting like we're still in the old world," he said, and the conversation ended right there because he'd already decided he was right. I picked up my folder and walked out, and the heat that hit me outside the office door felt more honest than anything he'd said. Midsummer came in hard, the kind of week where the asphalt looked soft and your shirt stuck to your back before you finished your first cup of coffee. We had a critical approval window for a major commercial, a high-dollar job with a complicated stunt day that needed final sign-offs, insurance confirmations, and a city permit stamp that did not get rushed just because someone had a big ego. My desk was covered in checklists and call logs, and my phone didn't stop vibrating because everyone wanted an answer right now. That's when Tanner announced an all-hands mandatory culture celebration on the same afternoon, right in the middle of our approval grind, like balloons and speeches were more important than keeping the company alive. Cassidy strutted around the bullpen selling it like a reward and a threat at the same time. She said, "If you're not there, you're not aligned, and people will notice who is committed." A couple people laughed nervously, and I watched them do it like they were swallowing nails. I didn't argue in public because I had work that couldn't wait for her pep rally. I sent Tanner a clean, professional email that said I could not attend because I had a time-sensitive compliance check and a city office deadline tied to active filming. I copied the right people and kept it dry on purpose because I wasn't interested in giving him a quote he could twist. The next morning I showed up early, sweating through my shirt before I even made it past the front doors. I swiped my badge and got a red light like I'd never worked there a day in my life, and when I tried again, the reader beeped at me like it was offended. I stepped inside anyway when someone else came through, went to my desk, and my system login was dead with a message that might as well have said, "Good luck." I was still staring at the screen when Tanner walked up with Cassidy and 2 security guys in plain black polos who looked like they hoped I'd keep it calm. Tanner didn't waste time pretending. "This is a culture misalignment issue," he said, like he'd diagnosed me with a disease. Cassidy stood a half step behind him, watching my face like she was waiting for the clip she could use. I kept my hands flat on the desk and said, "My signature isn't a formality, and some approvals depend on continuity and verified signers, not team spirit." Tanner's smile stayed locked in place, and his eyes didn't. "Everyone's replaceable," he said, and he made it sound like wisdom instead of arrogance. I stood up, grabbed my folder and my jacket, and walked out without raising my voice or giving Cassidy her show. Outside, the heat hit me again, thick and mean, and I sat in my truck with both hands on the wheel until my knuckles went pale. Then I turned the key and started the engine. The air conditioner kicked on like it was trying to save me from my own blood pressure, and I pulled out of that lot slow so nobody could say I peeled out like a kid. My hands still felt stiff on the wheel, but my head was clearing away it hadn't been for months. I wasn't going to rage post, and I wasn't going to threaten anybody, because that was how they'd paint me, as unstable and useless. If Tanner wanted drama, he was going to star in his own show without me. I drove a few blocks and parked under the sad shade of a skinny tree behind a strip mall, where nobody paid attention to anything unless it was blocking a loading dock. I popped my laptop open on the passenger seat and tethered to my phone because I wasn't a rookie, and I wasn't using anything Arcadia could touch. My personal email was already logged in, and my contact list was already built from a decade of doing the work the right way. I started typing a plain notice with no heat and no insults, just facts. The message was short on purpose, the kind of thing you could read twice and still not find a hook to argue with. I stated that I was no longer employed by Arcadia Set and Safety Services, and I was no longer the recognized signer for ongoing compliance, permits, or safety continuity. I quoted the continuity language the way it was written, dry and boring and bulletproof, and I added one line that mattered: services may be paused pending verification of a qualified replacement. Then I hit send to the union contacts, insurer contacts, and the city offices that relied on my authorization. The first call came fast, and it was Big Sal Donato. He didn't waste time with sympathy, because that wasn't his style, and honestly I respected him for it. "If you're out, my people don't work until the safety chain is clear," he said, voice low like a warning. I answered, "That is exactly how the agreements are supposed to work, and I'm not bending them for anybody's ego." After Sal, my phone turned into a siren that wouldn't quit. An insurer contact asked, "Who's signing now, Blaine? Because we need a verified name today." And I told her, "Tanner Caldwell is the chief executive, so Tanner Caldwell is the one holding that responsibility." A city permit clerk called with a tired voice and said, "We have a stamp window closing and your name is on the file, so who is authorized now?" And I repeated, "Tanner Caldwell is the chief executive, and I do not have authority." Then a production manager tried to charm me into helping and said, "Can you just push it through so the crew doesn't get punished?" And I shut it down with, "I cannot sign what I do not control, and you should not want me to." Once I'd said it enough times, I stopped answering unknown numbers because I wasn't going to get pulled into side deals. I needed somewhere neutral and public, somewhere I could sit like a normal person without anyone claiming I'd snuck into the office to break systems or steal files. I drove to Dee's Diner near the stages, parked where the security cameras could see my truck, and walked inside like I belonged there. I slid into a booth, ordered coffee, and set my phone on the table face down. Tanner called, and I let it ring until it quit on its own because I wasn't giving him a soundbite. Cassidy called right after, and I let that ring too because she was even worse, and she loved a recorded moment. I wasn't playing games, I was staying clean, and there's a difference that matters when lawyers start sniffing around. I took a sip of coffee and kept my eyes on the door. Marilyn Crane from payroll texted me, and the words came in fast like her hands were shaking. She said, "Tanner is already telling people you broke something and that's why access got shut off." I texted back, "I did not touch a thing, and you can say that if anyone asks you directly." Then I added, "I just stopped being the signer, and they are learning what that means." A couple booths over, Dee's regulars were already passing the story around in pieces, the way crews always do when management goes quiet. One guy said, "They just told our department to stand down because approvals are on hold," and another answered, "Locations are getting pulled, and nobody can explain why." I heard Cassidy's name more than once, always said like a joke that stopped being funny. People weren't panicking yet, but they were confused, and confusion on a production day turns into anger fast. Sitting there, I understood exactly what I'd triggered, and it wasn't chaos, it was friction. The machine wasn't exploding, it was freezing, exactly the way those agreements were designed to freeze when somebody tried to skip the grown-up steps. Tanner wanted to run Arcadia on smiles and slogans, but the real world ran on verification and signatures and consequences. I lifted my phone, opened my email, and started sorting the incoming replies into a folder labeled Continuity Notices. Replies kept popping in while I built that Continuity Notices folder, and each one sounded more nervous than the last. My phone buzzed again, and when I flipped it over, I saw Cassidy's name like a smear I couldn't scrub off. I stared at it long enough to make my point to myself, then I answered because I wanted a clean record of whatever she tried next. Her voice came in fake soft, like we were old friends catching up over brunch instead of enemies in a parking lot war. "Blaine, I just need one quick help to protect the crew, and then I will let you get back to your day," she said, drawing the words out like I owed her comfort. I kept my tone flat and said, "If you are calling for a favor, you should stop now because I do not work there anymore." She didn't even pause, just slid right into the ask like it was normal. "Tanner is overwhelmed, and we need a code and one signature to unlock the approvals because the production is getting loud and people are scared," she said, leaning hard on the word crew. I answered simple and slow, so there was no confusion later. I do not share credentials, I do not sign under someone else's authority, and I do not volunteer to be the fall guy for a company that fired me. She tried guilt first, pushing her voice lower like she was confiding in me. You always said you cared about safety, so prove it and do this one small thing, she said, and I could hear the smile behind it. I shot back, if you cared about safety, you would not be asking a former employee to bypass controls, and you would be telling Tanner to stop forcing work without verified sign-off. Then she tried flirting like it was a switch she could flip, and it made my skin crawl because it was so calculated. Come on, Blaine, you and I both know you're the only adult in the room, and I can make sure people remember who saved the day, she said, like praise was payment. I didn't take the bait, and I didn't raise my voice. I do not need your approval, and I do not need your story, because the paperwork is the only story that matters. When that didn't work, she went sharp and angry, like the mask slid off and hit the floor. So, you are really going to punish innocent workers because your feelings got hurt, she snapped, and I could picture her pacing with that phone held high. I said, my feelings have nothing to do with it, and you do not get to frame your shortcut as my responsibility. That's when she did the dumbest thing, and she did it like she thought it made her powerful. I heard a little echo, and she said, just so you know, you're on speaker for transparency, and I may be recording this so nobody lies later. I didn't flinch, and I made sure my words were clean enough to stand on their own. You are asking me to do something unauthorized, and I will not participate in anything that could be construed as bypassing company controls or signing without authority. She hung up not long after that, and I knew exactly what she'd do with it because she lived for clips. Sure enough, later, someone sent me a link showing she'd posted a chopped version with a toxic workplace caption, acting like she was the brave one. The problem for her was my calm wording stayed calm even out of context, and it made her sound like the person pressuring a fired employee to break rules. Not long after, Ramon Miami Ray Ibarra called, and I answered on the first ring because Ray didn't waste air. His voice had that set lot noise behind it, forklifts and shouted cues, and he got right to it. They are pushing us to proceed without the usual sign-off chain, and I need to know what you want me to do, he said, clipped and serious. I kept it tight because I wasn't giving legal advice, and I wasn't stepping back into their mess. Stop any work that needs continuity sign-off, keep people clear of risk, document everything you see, and do not let pride get someone hurt, I told him, and he didn't argue because he'd seen what pride did. Later, he called back and said, they are trying to paper over missing steps with last-minute emails and loud confidence, and his disgust came through even when he kept it professional. By nightfall, the call stopped for 10 full minutes, and that silence hit harder than the shouting ever did, because quiet on a production day usually meant something already went wrong. I slid out of the booth, stepped into the heat outside Dee's diner, and thumbed Ray's number until the screen started ringing again. Ray picked up on the third ring, and I could hear the lot noise behind him like the whole place was breathing hard. He sounded tight but steady, which told me he hadn't let anyone bully him into something stupid. I heard you calling back, and I'm still on the clock, but I'm keeping my people clear, he said, like he needed it on record. I answered, stay that way and do not let anyone talk you into moving forward without the chain, because you are the one who has to live with it. He told me, I already started a written log, and I'm saving every email that looks like a patch job. And I said, good, keep it clean and keep it boring, because boring paperwork is what survives lawsuits. When I hung up, the air outside the diner felt thicker, and my phone sat quiet again like it was holding its breath. I didn't chase revenge by screaming, because screaming was free, and it solved nothing. I chased leverage by making one call I'd ignored for years, the call to the guy who'd been trying to recruit me since I still had Warren's old number in my favorites. I stepped away from the door so Dee's regulars couldn't hear me, scrolled to the contact, and hit call. Dorian Thorne answered like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Blaine, I was starting to think you liked being underpaid, he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. I didn't laugh. I'm free, and Arcadia is about to learn what continuity actually means, I told him, and I let that sentence hang there long enough to land. He went straight to the obvious play. Name your number and I'll get you a package by tomorrow, he said, like money was always the lever. I cut him off because that wasn't the point, and he needed to understand it up front. Money matters, but it isn't the point, because I want authority and clean lines, and I don't want some culture department stepping into compliance like it's a hobby. He didn't act offended, which told me he was smarter than Tanner. Then we talk structure first, and we do it in writing, he said, and I answered, good, because writing is the only promise I trust. We met the next day in a plain restaurant off a side street, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting too long. I picked it on purpose because I didn't want ego in the air, and I didn't want anyone thinking this was some fancy betrayal scene. Dorian showed up in a crisp shirt, calm eyes, and that sharp confidence that never raised its voice. He slid into the booth and said, tell me what you actually bring. not what you feel. I kept it legal and clean because my name was still my whole career. I bring relationships, credibility, and a reputation with unions, insurers, and city offices that can't be bought overnight, I said, and I watched his expression tighten like he was doing math. He nodded once and answered, "That's the asset, and I'm not stupid enough to interfere with it." Then he laid out a structure where I ran my lane without someone breathing down my neck, and he said it like he meant it. "Compliance is yours, and nobody signs over you," he told me, and I said, "Put that sentence in the agreement, because that sentence is why I'm here." This was where my personal problem tightened into a knot I couldn't ignore. I needed stable coverage and a steady check because my kid was still in college and my ex-wife didn't care how messy my work life got. I also needed to keep my name clean because one bad signature under someone else's authority could burn everything I'd built. Dorian saw it without me begging. "We'll get you benefits day one, and we'll keep your chain documented," he said, and I nodded because that was the adult answer. He brought over a young guy with a notepad and quick eyes. "This is Orrin Dax, and he's going to make sure nothing slips," Dorian said. Orrin didn't talk big, and I liked him immediately for that. "Mr. Fraser, I'll draft what you want exactly as stated, and I'll flag anything that creates risk," he said, and I answered, "Do that, and you'll stay useful." While Orrin typed, my phone buzzed with a forwarded message from Marilyn. Arcadia was circulating a story that I abandoned the team and created a safety emergency, like they could rewrite reality by repeating it. I texted her back under the table. "Save every email, every memo, every weird request, because when people shape a narrative, the facts are ugly." Then I set the phone down and looked Dorian in the eye. "They're going to cause collateral damage, and I'm not letting working people pay for their panic," I said. Dorian slid the printed agreement across to me, and I signed it slow, then folded it into my folder and walked out into the heat with my new badge paperwork in my hand. My shirt stuck to my shoulder blades, and the parking lot shimmered like it was pretending to be water. I got to my truck and tossed the folder onto the passenger seat like it weighed more than paper, because it did. My phone lit up again before I even shut the door, and for a second I expected it to be another Arcadia number trying to drag me back into their mess. Instead, it was Ray. I answered fast, and his voice sounded different, lower and tight, like he was trying not to explode in front of his crew. "Blaine, somebody got hurt during a rushed setup and they just stopped work like somebody pulled the plug," he said. I didn't ask for details like it was gossip because I didn't need the picture in my head. "Is the person alive and getting care, and did they lock the area down?" I asked, keeping my tone hard and clean. Ray said, "They're alive and being handled, but it was serious enough that the whole day just turned into a freeze." I told him, "Document everything you saw and everything you were told, and do not let anyone rewrite the timeline while people are still shaking." Not long after I hung up, Big Sal called, and that told me this wasn't going to get buried with a quick email and a donut box. Sal didn't ease into it because he never did. "Tanner cut a required safety roll to save money, and that gap is exactly where people get hurt," he said, like he was reading a verdict. I answered, "That is what I warned them about, and now they are going to pretend it was somebody else's fault." Sal stayed steady, but I could hear the anger underneath, the kind that comes from seeing the same stupid cycle over and over. "My people are done until investigators clear the chain, and I want you to keep your hands clean," he said. I told him, "My hands have been clean since they locked me out, and I'm not stepping back in without everything in writing." He paused, then added, "Good, because they're going to look for a scapegoat the second the paperwork shows up." The official notice hit inboxes later that evening, and I got it forwarded from 2 different people before I even asked. It read like every state labor and OSHA-style message I'd ever seen, all hard edges and deadlines. Work stoppage, document preservation, interviews scheduled, and no tolerance for missing records. I sat in my truck with the engine off, reading it twice, and the worst part was how predictable it all felt. The next morning, Gideon Baines called me, and I didn't need an introduction because I'd seen his name on enough legal threads. His voice came smooth and careful, like he was trying to keep a lid on a boiling pot. "Blaine, I'd like to talk quietly and see if we can resolve a few issues," he said. I answered, "Quiet is lawyer language for scared, so say what you actually want." He offered a settlement first, like he was tossing a bone to a dog he didn't respect. Then he slid into the real pitch, the one he thought sounded reasonable. "We bring you back temporarily. You sign a few things to stabilize continuity, and we present this as a transition misunderstanding," he said, like words could erase injuries. I told him, "Send everything in writing, because I am not agreeing to anything on a phone call." When his email came through, it took me about 10 seconds to see the trap. The document labeled me as the continuity safety officer, with language that shoved responsibility right onto my back, like a loaded backpack. They wanted my signature to make it look like I'd been in charge when the incident happened, even though they'd fired me and killed my access. I felt my teeth grind, and I muttered to myself, "That is not a mistake. That is a setup." before I saved the file to a folder marked Legal. I went to Arcadia's record storage the right way, not sneaking, not breaking anything, because I wasn't there to sabotage. I'd emailed the records desk asking for supervised access to pull copies of any agreements that referenced my signatory role, and they told me to come in and sign the visitor log. I knew where the old agreements were kept, and I needed originals to protect myself before someone lost the pages that mattered. The place smelled like dust and cardboard, and the fluorescent lights made everything look sickly. I signed the visitor log, walked between metal shelves, and pulled boxes like I'd done it 100 times. Gideon showed up while I was flipping through a binder, and he looked tired, not angry, like a man watching a business fail one avoidable step at a time. He didn't bark orders, and that alone told me the board was squeezing him. "The board asked me to find a solution, and I'm trying to prevent this from getting worse," he said. I answered, "Then stop trying to hand me blame like it's a solution." I found what I came for, the old language tying safety accountability to the active executive chain once the key signer was removed. I laid it flat on a table, took a clear photo, and made copies the right way, slow and exact, so nobody could claim I altered anything. Gideon watched my hands like he wanted to interrupt, then thought better of it. I slid his trap document back toward him and said, "I am not signing blame for an incident that happened after you revoked my authority, and if you want to fix this, start with the truth." Then I tucked the copies into my folder and walked for the exit. I walked out of Arcadia's record storage into daylight that felt way too normal for what was happening. The folder in my hand was thin, but it carried the kind of weight that makes people lie faster. I got to my truck, shut the door, and my phone buzzed again like it had been waiting for me to sit down. Marilyn called this time, and the second I heard her voice, I knew she'd just lived through something ugly. She sounded shaky, like she'd been trying to breathe quietly so nobody accused her of being emotional. "Warren came back early, Blaine, and it blew up in the boardroom," she said, and her words came out quick like she was scared the line was monitored. I told her, "Slow down and tell me what matters, because panic stories help nobody." I didn't witness Warren's first explosion, but Marilyn painted it so clear I could see it anyway. Warren flew back the minute the injury and stoppage hit his radar, and Tanner tried to sell him that same cheap story about a disgruntled employee sabotaging the company. Marilyn said Warren kept asking basic questions, the grown-up questions, and the room kept answering with buzzwords instead of facts. He kept asking who approved what, who signed what, and why the insurer was pausing coverage, she said, and her voice cracked on the word pausing, like she knew what that really meant. Tanner couldn't answer because Tanner's whole system was built on talking, not tracking. That's what happens when you replace procedure with performance and then act shocked when the real world asks for receipts. Marilyn told me Warren finally stopped listening and started demanding, and Tanner got defensive like a kid caught cheating. Tanner kept saying you abandoned the team, and Warren kept saying he didn't care about feelings. He cared about signatures, she said, and I could hear her swallow hard like she regretted being in the middle. About an hour later, my phone rang again, and this time the name on the screen hit me like a punch I'd been expecting. Warren Caldwell. I answered because Warren wasn't Cassidy, and he wasn't Tanner, and I didn't play games with the man who built the place. "Blaine, I need facts, not stories," he said, and there was no softness in it, just pressure. I told him, "If you want facts, then we meet somewhere public and simple, and you listen without spinning." He picked a small airfield parking lot, the kind with chain-link fencing and a couple tired hangars. When I pulled in, I saw him standing near his rental, shoulders squared, face red from heat and anger. No entourage, no cameras, no culture nonsense, just an older man realizing his kid had been driving the business like it was a toy. He nodded toward my truck, and I waved him around to the passenger side. Warren climbed in, shut the door, and looked at me like he was trying to figure out where the truth ended and the excuses began. "They're saying you broke systems and triggered a shutdown," he said, and he didn't sound like he believed it, but he needed to hear me say it out loud. I kept my voice calm because calm is what survives transcripts and memory. "I didn't break your system, Warren. I stopped holding it together after they removed me, and every hold was triggered by your own agreements the moment continuity got chopped." He stared straight ahead for a second, jaw working. Then he asked the question like it was the easiest fix in the world. "Do you want your job back?" he said, blunt and direct. I didn't hesitate because hesitation is how people think you're bargaining. "No, because I am not coming back to clean up a mess made by people who refused to respect the work while I was doing it," I told him, and I watched his shoulders tighten like the answer hurt his pride. I leaned in just enough to make sure he heard the part that mattered. "My condition isn't about pride, it's about protecting crews, so severance gets paid, benefits get handled, and there's no retaliation against the people who didn't cause this," I said. Warren didn't like hearing it, and I could see the irritation flicker, but he understood it in a way Tanner never could. "That's going to be a fight," he said, and I answered, "Then fight it, because those people are the only reason your company ever worked." Before I left, Marilyn forwarded me a short internal note, and it landed in my inbox like a threat written in office language. The board was looking for someone to blame, and Tanner was pushing my name hard, like he could bury his own mess under mine. I showed Warren the screen for a second, then I locked it because I wasn't going to beg. I started the engine, put my truck in gear, and drove out of that airfield lot. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, and I didn't look at it until I hit the next light because I wasn't trying to be a headline myself. When I finally glanced down, it was Marilyn again, and the subject line alone told me Tanner had decided to make things worse on purpose. I pulled into a gas station lot, parked where the cameras could see the front of my truck, and opened the email Marilyn forwarded. It was a company-wide message from Tanner, written like he was fighting ghosts with a keyboard. He accused me of sabotage, called me obsolete, and painted himself like some brave leader betrayed by negative people who didn't believe in the vision. The tone was pure tantrum dressed up as inspiration, and it had that same fake clean language he used when he wanted people to clap instead of ask questions. Then I saw the twist, sitting right there under his signature line like a mistake already in motion. There was an attachment labeled Project Vibes, and I knew instantly he didn't mean to send it to everybody because nobody willingly hands out their own receipts when investigators are already circling. I opened it and felt my mouth go dry, not from surprise, but from how stupid it was. It wasn't a real budget, and it wasn't even trying to look normal. It was a list of payments routed through sketchy vendors, with descriptions like retreats, brand experiences, and personal perks that didn't match any legit operational need. Marilyn called before I could even scroll to the bottom, and her voice sounded like she was talking through her teeth so nobody near her desk could hear. Payroll has been uneasy for months, but we never had proof we could point at, she said, and I could hear papers shifting like she was hiding something in a drawer. I told her, that file is proof, and it came from Tanner's own hand, so save it exactly as received and do not edit anything. She answered, I already forwarded it to myself and printed a copy for a sealed envelope. And I said, good, because the first thing they do is pretend it never existed. By the time I left the gas station lot, Cassidy had already started her escape act because she could smell blame coming like smoke. Someone sent me her polished apology video, all soft lighting and careful words, and it made my skin itch because it was such a performance. She framed herself as a victim of toxic leadership, like she hadn't been steering the narrative all year with her huddles, her pressure, and her little recordings. She didn't apologize for the shortcuts or the shaming, she apologized for how people felt, which is what liars do when facts are too sharp. Gideon called not long after, and his tone had changed so much I almost laughed. He didn't sound confident anymore, and he wasn't offering quiet deals like he had control of the room. Blaine, I need to know where you got that file, he said, careful and clipped, like every word was being weighed. I kept it clean and told him, I did not get anything, Gideon, because Arcadia broadcast it to the whole company like a fireworks accident. He paused, then said, forward it to me exactly as you received it, and I answered, you can get it from your own server logs, but I will not be your document courier. Big Sal confirmed what I already expected, and he did it in that flat voice that meant the gloves were off. The union will cooperate with investigators and we will protect the crews, not the suits, he told me, and I could hear phones ringing behind him like his office was a war room. I said, that is how it should be, because the crews are the ones bleeding when leadership plays games. Sal added, once money and safety failures sit in the same pile, law enforcement starts paying attention, and he wasn't guessing. He was warning me about what was already moving. The calls and messages stacked up through the afternoon, because once investigators saw the injury, the work stoppage, and that Project Vibes mess in the same week, the story stopped being internal drama. It turned into the kind of thing that gets subpoenas and interviews with people who don't care about anyone's brand. Dorian called me near the end of the day, and his voice had that sharp edge, like he could taste opportunity. Do you want to go after their clients while they're exposed? He asked, like it was a normal business question. I didn't hesitate, because I wasn't playing villain, and I wasn't interested in hurting working people who had nothing to do with Tanner's ego. I am not trying to ruin crews or punish families, and I want the people who played games with safety and money to face consequences, I told him. Dorian stayed quiet for a beat, then said, if we take the work, we take the mess too, and I answered, then we take the work the right way, and we don't let benefits get used as leverage. That night I made the call that turned revenge into restoration, and I did it with my voice steady and my terms clear. I told Dorian, if we're going to absorb the work, we're also going to protect crew benefits, even if it takes a hard-nosed deal to make it happen. And then I followed it with, put that commitment in writing, before I ended the call and sent the message. After I sent the message, the next few days came at me in chopped-up reports. Marilyn fed me board gossip and cautious texts. Big Sal fed me union facts and blunt calls, and Gideon fed me one cold update that told me the walls were closing in. Tanner's boxed in, Gideon said. Investigators are coming from more than one direction, and the board is panicking. I told him they should have panicked before someone got hurt. Warren finally swallowed the ugly truth. Tanner's culture wasn't just annoying, it was expensive, reckless, and it had put bodies at risk. Arcadia started bleeding work, credibility, and cash at the same time, and once the insurer paused and the union held, the slow collapse would have crushed the crews first. Gideon didn't spell out agency name, but he didn't have to. He said subpoenas were landing, bank records were getting requested, and Tanner's Project Vibes list had turned a safety investigation into a money investigation. Warren's friends on the board stopped arguing about coaching and started arguing about survival because a sale was the only off-ramp left. I sat across from Dorian in his office and pitched the move I'd been building in my head since the injury notice. We buy the key Arcadia assets in a distressed purchase for $1, I said, and we assume only the liabilities tied to crew benefits in writing so nobody can forget later. Dorian's eyes narrowed like I'd asked him to adopt a stray dog. That sounds sentimental, Blaine, he said. Business isn't a charity. I leaned forward and kept my voice steady. Loyalty isn't free, and it's purchased by doing the right thing when it costs you, I told him. If the crews see protection, they follow the new banner without a war, and we keep the work moving. Big Sal backed me in his own way when Dorian took the next call on speaker. My people don't trust suits, Sal said, but they trust benefits in their accounts and rules that don't bend. Dorian exhaled hard and said, "Send me the term sheet." Marilyn confirmed severance checks were being processed under pressure, and for the first time in weeks, her voice sounded lighter. "People are scared, but they're getting paid," she said. I told her, "Keep copies of every confirmation and do not let anybody rewrite dates." Cassidy tried to rebrand as a survivor and teased some media project, but I didn't touch that mess. I just made sure the legal record stayed louder than her clips. Orrin started with me at the new place and did what good young guys did. He worked, learned, and didn't pretend he invented the world yesterday. Weeks later, I sat in a normal office with normal coffee and felt steady ground under my feet. Tanner thought I was a cog, so I signed my first clean approval under my new letterhead and got back to work. Hold up before you bounce. If your workplace tried to make you carry the blame after they cut you loose, would you protect yourself even if it shut everything down? If you've got the hype feature, tap it to support this video and help it reach more people. And please subscribe and hit like, it really matters and it's one click. Then leave a comment, say good story, or tell me what you would have done.